everybody. Welcome to RJ Julia Booksellers. We are so honored that you're here for our virtual event with Alison McGhee. I'm so thrilled to be hosting because her books are probably in my top, 10 or 20 books that I have ever read because they've affected me so greatly. And when I got the chance to do this, I jumped at the chance. So The Opposite of Fate truly is probably now one of my favorite books. But I'm going to read just a little bit about Alison to introduce her, and then she's going to take it away. Alison McGhee's best-selling novel, Shadow Baby, was a Today Book Club pick, and her picture book for adults, Someday, was a #1 New York Times bestseller. She is the recipient of many fellowships and awards, has 3 grown children, and lives a semi-nomadic life in Minnesota and California. So welcome, Alison.
Thank you so much. I'm clapping for all of you. Thank you everyone for showing up in our new world that we're all living in. Thanks so much. RJ Julia, one of my favorite bookstores. It is not in my hometown, but it's the perfect store in my opinion. So Karen, your kind words about my books are reflected in the way I feel about RJ Julia. I love that place. And being able to pivot on a dime like we all have in this new strange world we're living in means that at least I get to see you. I get to see tiny faces on a screen, and it means so much to me. The first event I did last week like this, honestly, it almost made me a little teary because I miss people so much. I miss just brushing up against people on the street. And a screen is a far removed from that, but somehow I feel close to everyone. So thank you. All right, my new book. I'm not good with visuals here, but here we go. Kind of matches my hair, my background. I planned it that way, not. I thought I would give you a little bit of scene setting. I'm not going to give away any spoilers from the book, but I will read a little bit from the opener and the first couple of chapters, and then tell you a little bit about the influences that came to bear on my inspiration for writing the book. So The Opposite of Fate is told primarily in 2 separate voices. One is the voice of 23-year-old Mally Williams, who at the moment the book opens has just opened her eyes after unconscious for 16 months. She has no idea what happened to her in that time. But William T. Jones, who is the other voice of the book, knows exactly what happened to her because he has been watching over her ever since the night that she fell unconscious. Mally was 21 the night that she was assaulted and left for dead and taken to a hospital. And in those 16 months, a great deal has happened. So the prologue to the book, which is just 1 short page, will let you know a little bit about that. And then I'll read part of the first chapter told in William T. Jones's voice, and part of the next chapter told in Mally's voice. William T. Jones is the 65-year-old man who has been like a father figure to Mally for most of her life. Her own father died when she was 9, and William T. Jones is her neighbor about half a mile up the road in the very, very rural place where they live. That very, very rural place is the same place where I grew up and where all of my adult books are set. I was 18, barely 18 when I left for college. I have never been back to the landscape of my youth for more than a week at a time, and yet all my adult books are set there. So I think that says something about the influence of childhood and place. All right. That place is far upstate New York, by the way, 6 hours north of the city in the southwestern foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, where there is a whole lot of woods and fields and foothills and not a lot of people. Okay, the opposite of fate, part 1. In the beginning, a girl lay in a hospital bed in a room with white walls and a single window. Her name was Mally Williams. She was 21 years old. She lay there for many months, months in which people came and went from the white room. Had she been conscious, she would have recognized some of them, the ones she had known most of her life. William T. Jones, her neighbor up the road, Crystal Zielinski, his girlfriend and the owner of Crystal's Diner, Charlie, her younger brother, Lucia, her mother, and Zach, her boyfriend. Others Mally would not have known. The doctors and nurses in their scrubs and white coats, stethoscopes slung around their necks, noiseless shoes on their feet. The lawyers, the guardian ad litem, the members of Lucia's church who gathered round her bedside to pray. The young orderly with the yellow cap, gold earring dangling from his ear, who once a day entered the white room and pushed his mop around the tile floor until it gleamed. Months went by. Most things remained the same in the white room. The doctors and nurses settled into routine and resignation, and finally into the kind of watchful resentment that sometimes happens in the face of hope turned hopeless. Until they were banned from the room, William T. and Crystal and Charlie gathered daily around Mally's bed. So did her boyfriend, Zach. They tried hard, but in the end, even Zach's face changed from worry to anger and finally to resignation. Outside the hospital, others also kept watch. Protesters carrying signs, trying to sway the decisions of the people within the hospital's doors. In the quiet white room with the double glazed window, Mally lay silent and asleep and unaware of the debate and protests and media coverage swirling around her. By all appearances, she was also unaware of the complicated emotions that anguished the people who loved her, the ones who came and went from her bedside. Her dark hair grew long and silky. Her skin softened, its freckles and few lines smoothing and disappearing over time. These changes were small and subtle, noticeable only to the people close to her. It was Mally's stomach that everyone noticed. Flat and muscled on the night she was admitted, her belly over time mounded itself and became the first thing anyone looked at when they walked into the white room. Such a small thing in the great scheme of the world, new life. But this particular new life was complicated. For a while, it was all anyone who knew her talked about. All right, that's the prologue-ish page. Now we're moving on to the voice of William T. Jones, and it is 16 months after. William T. Jones. Dark birds. That was the second thing Mally said when she began to talk again. Her eyes were open and looking toward the window of her room at St. John's. Dark birds, she whispered, and he quickly followed her gaze. Did her words mean her vision was unharmed along with her ability to talk? Did she see crows, grackles, starlings maybe? But he saw nothing, nothing but sky. I don't see any birds, Mally. Back and forth, she turned her head on the pillow, trying to shake it maybe. He was holding her hand. Her fingers were so smooth. She was young, only 23, but still. This was what happened when you didn't use your hands. All the roughness went away. Her hands were the hands of a baby, and he remembered her as a baby. He had been in his 40s then, a neighbor helping out her widowed mother, Lucia. Over time, he had grown to be a father of sorts to Mally and her younger brother, Charlie. Dark birds, she whispered again. Her soft fingers twitched in his. She was trying to tell him something, but what he didn't know. That was all right. She would find a way. All the long months of waiting, of watching, of hoping that her body would finally recover had taught him something about patience and time and the nature thereof. What had she said first? William T. All his life, he'd heard his name spoken, yelled, called out by familiar and unfamiliar voices, people who loved him and people who didn't. But had he ever thought about his name until now? Had he ever felt his name as a physical thing whispering into his body in the voice of someone he'd known since she was a child, someone he'd helped raise, someone he thought of as almost a daughter? William T. She knew who he was. She was saying his name. Welcome back to the world, Mally. When William T. got home that afternoon, he waited on the porch for Crystal. It took her an hour after the diner closed to put it in order for the next day. When her headlights swept across the driveway, he stood up. The look on his face must have told her what she wanted to hear, because she flung open the car door, broke into a run, and threw her arms around him. They stood there on the porch, swaying from side to side, while he told her how Mally had looked at him right in the eye and said his name. How she had gone back to sleep within a few minutes, but still she had spoken. William T. She had recognized him. What should we tell her at this point? That she was just unlucky, he said later? That she was unconscious for a long time with an undiagnosed brain infection? The initial excitement had passed, and the reality of the situation, everything that Mally didn't know, was already weighing on them. Crystal stood at the kitchen counter, measuring coffee into the coffee maker for the next morning. I mean, there was the initial brain injury, he said, but still, it's the truth. It's part of the truth, she said. It leaves out the most important truth. I just want to buy her some time, he said. Would you rather she found out the whole story from us or from the rest of the world? Crystal clicked down the lid on the coffee maker and turned to face him. Because as of today, we're out of time, William T. If we, or maybe Charlie, don't tell her, someone else will. Better the news comes from us. We're the ones who love her. And now, next chapter, we are in Mally Williams's voice. Mally Williams. William T. was saying something about birds, how he didn't see any and where were they, but she hadn't said anything about birds. She closed her eyes and her fingers pressed against his. Please, be quiet, they were trying to tell him, and he must have gotten the message because he shut up. The blanket on her was soft, and William T.'s hand was big and warm. And maybe this was a dream, the kind that felt real. She opened her eyes again and looked toward the window, toward the blue-green foothills of the Adirondacks, but the window was a blurry gray rectangle. She tried to focus her eyes, but it was too much effort. If she was home, though, then why was William T. there, sitting next to her bed? There was something in his eyes, something he must not have wanted her to see because he blinked, but too late, she saw it anyway. He began to nod and smile and cry, all at the same time. I don't know what you're talking about, Mally, with the birds, but we'll figure it out. Tired, sleep. When she opened her eyes again, she turned her head and saw a sink with a mirror above it. Look in the mirror, was the thought that came into her head. But when she tried to sit up, swing her legs over the side of the bed, they hardly moved. It felt as if they were buried in sand. Legs, she tried to say. What is it, Mally? Again, she tried to move her legs, kick off the invisible sand, but it took enormous effort. Tried to talk, but nothing. Tried to move her arms, but they too were leaden. Move, she commanded her body, move. William T. was looking at her, and he knew. She could tell that somehow he knew what was going on inside her. Don't be scared, he said. It's your muscles. They have to build back up. But now that you're back, now that you're up, now that you're on the mend, it won't take long, a few months. For the first time, he sounded like the real William T., even though his voice was 10 times quieter than usual. He smiled at her. His eyes and his smile and his whole big body were so full of hope and so full of something else, something she didn't understand. She looked at the sink again, the mirror, the linoleum floor, and the few steps it would take to cross it, steps she couldn't take. Now that you're on the mend, now that you're back from where? What happened to me? She said. She was awake again. It was the next day or the next week. Time had passed. That was all she knew. And William T. was back. She was tired. Do you remember anything? He said. No. As soon as she said that, something did come to her, though. Rain. Less rain and more mist, mist that felt like petals of water. William T. picked up her hand and closed both his hands around it, those big paws. Rain, maybe, she said. Maybe it was raining that night. That night, he said. Yeah, that night. She didn't know what she meant by that night, but yes, that night. That night was dark and she was walking. The sidewalk, or was it the street, shone under the street lamp. The street lamp was at the end of the block, a shining block with an old stone church set back on a lawn. William T. held her hand and waited. Dark, she said. I was walking. It was pretty. Pretty because the street, or was it the sidewalk, or both, glimmered under the light from the street lamp. The sensation of falling came to her. Pretty? There was something in his voice. He didn't like the word. He hated that she had said the word pretty. She could feel his tension. Yeah, the sidewalk was pretty. It was shining, shining. She pulled her hand out of his and laced her fingers together. Am I right about the rain and that it was dark and it was pretty and I was walking down a street? I don't know for sure. I wasn't with you. Where were you? She was a robot who could talk only in sentences that ended with question marks. A dark night, rain, pretty. She tried to follow her memory to the end of the street past the church. A church? Where had she been and where had she been going? But that was where memory stopped. Did a car hit me? It was wet. Did I slip? Was I drunk? Did I wobble into the street? The sensation of falling was a clear, soft memory. William T. was shaking his head. It's been a long time, Melly. He kept saying that like it would explain everything. It's been a long time, which would explain why her hair was so long. And she had bangs now, tickling her forehead. Bangs? She'd always hated bangs. How long? He looked past her at the door that led to the hallway and its smooth cinder block walls and Beanie, the orderly with the yellow cap, the murmurings behind the ajar doors of other rooms. It was the rehab wing of St. John's, that much she had learned. Hospital-like, fluorescent lit, not like the places where she worked as a massage therapist. Those places, the massage center and the massage room at the women's shelter were quiet and serene, lit with soft lamps. More than a year, Mallow Cup. You were unconscious for 16 months. Not Mally, but Mallow Cup, the name he alone called her, his favorite candy bar. It brought her childhood rushing back over her, but the way he was saying it in that hushed voice was new. What? He said it again. 16 months. She couldn't take it in. What was 16 months? Not possible. That's what. Fog clouded her head. Was this a dream? All right, I'm going to end right there. And I would love to hear your questions, so keep them in mind, whether they are about this book, the writing process, anything you want to ask, but a little bit of backstory about this particular book. It was a long, long time coming, and I worked on it on and off for, I believe, 6 or 7 years. I began it the week after Well, a little more backstory. I have 3 kids, and when my older daughter went to college, she went to a beautiful little place in upstate New York. And before she left, I was talking to her and I said, you know, honey, I hate to say this, but I just worry. I worry about things like frat parties, and I want you to be very, very aware when you go to them. I want you to watch out for yourself at all times, and it is wrong that I am telling you this. Men need to learn not to rape, and that sexual assault is wrong, and blah, 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 very boiled down conversation. And off she went to school. And 2 years later, I woke up to the front page of the New York Times that there had been a gang rape at her school. I believe it was at a frat party or after one. And this sense of, I can't even describe it, sort of a culmination of my life as a woman and every woman's life as a woman, and my worry about my children, and that conversation I'd had with her before she went to college. It all just came screaming through me. And I believe it was the catalyst to start writing this book that I had had in my mind for quite a long time. So I began the actual writing of it the next week, but it also came from 2 stories that have haunted me my whole life. One, as a child, the story of Rip Van Winkle, which is always told as, you know, I remember it being read to me and talked about as sort of an ordinary story, a happy story with a great ending, because Rip Van Winkle woke up and returned to his life. And it just terrified me so much to think of losing out on 20 years of your life. And that fear was always in me. So when I started having my own children, I had a recurring nightmare, which I could not talk about to anyone out of superstition that it would come true. And that nightmare was that something happened to me, and I ended up in a unconscious for 20 years and woke up to find these 3 beautiful grown adults looking down at me in bed with this combination of sort of confusion and wonder and pity. And they looked vaguely familiar, and I realized that they were my children, and I had missed their entire lives. And I still get shaky when I think about that. It didn't come true. They're all grown, but still, it's a horror. The idea of missing out like that, missing out on these signature events of your life. And then I do not remember how old I was when this story played itself out in the media, but maybe some of you remember the Right to Die case of Terri Schiavo. She was a young woman. She was in what they call a vegetative state. Her husband wanted to remove her from life support so that she could die. Her parents fought her husband to keep her on life support in case she could return to life. And this was a huge media storm. It was a battle that dragged out in court for years. Finally, Terri Schiavo did die, but it haunted me. And I thought, I would try to place myself in her mind, in her husband's mind, in her parents' mind. I would turn it over in my mind, try to imagine the emotions and the pain in everyone surrounding that particular case. So that came to bear on the writing of the book. And the other thing was, throughout my entire life, the ongoing debate and impassioned beliefs of people on one side or the other of who has the right to terminate a pregnancy. And that was a really, fraught may be an overstatement, but it was a very intense aspect of writing this book to me. Many things about the writing of the book required me to be as deep a fiction writer as I can possibly be. When you're writing fiction, you need your people to be real people. And that means that you need to be inside their hearts and minds as fully as possible. Writing fiction is maybe the greatest exercise in empathy that I know. It's one of the reasons why I love it so much, because I can work hard to put myself inside someone's life who is nothing like me and imagine life through their eyes. And so for this book, there is a theme that runs throughout of people who believe that Mally's pregnancy, which you already know, I'm not giving away anything. She became pregnant as a result of the rape. And you know that from the prologue. There are people who believe that pregnancy should be allowed to continue. There are people who believe it would be best to end it. And in the case of someone like Mally, who's a young woman unable to speak for herself, with no advance health directive and no power of attorney and no will, because who at age 21 thinks to do those things, who gets to decide? Who should be appointed guardian of Mally? Should it be her mother? Is that the natural person? Should it be her boyfriend who knows her maybe better than anyone? Should it be William T., her beloved neighbor who's acted like a father to her most of her life? You know, who should it be? Who gets to decide what happens to this pregnancy? So throughout the book, these questions run. And even though Mally has woken up and has opened her eyes when the book opens, she still doesn't know anything that has happened to her. So the book is partly almost a mystery that advances. What happened? Who made these decisions? You know, what would Mally have wanted? She is learning slowly, piecemeal, all the tangents of everything that happened to her body while she was unconscious for 16 months. It was a complicated, very complicated book to write. It was a hard book to write. I had a lot of conversations with, oh my goodness, there was so much research that went into this book. Medical professionals, legal professionals, social workers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, massage therapists. Massage therapy is Mally's work. So on and off for about 6 years, I worked on the book. I figured out that one reason it was so hard was that I was writing toward a question mark instead of a period. And I had to take time and figure out what I myself thought and what I as writer thought could not affect what the people in the book thought. It's weird being a fiction writer. You know what you believe and what you think in life, but your people have their own lives and you have to let them live it. Whether or not you think they're making shitty decisions doesn't matter. You know, they are people in and of their own right. So I think that's enough backstory. I would love to hear any questions that anyone might have.
Well, you, in your books, to me, and especially this book, there's an intuitive nature to them that it's like you get inside of not only the character, but you got inside of me, and it was truly amazing. But it doesn't matter what book of yours I'm reading. This is like something that you do in books. Are you aware that you do that? That there's an intuitive nature to it?
Well, first, thank you, because I think that's the greatest compliment possible for a fiction writer, you know, that your people feel as real to the reader as they do to me. Is there an intuitive nature to it? I'm not aware that I do that. You know, I suffer from imposter syndrome like so many people do, you know. My boyfriend is a painter, we're both artists, and a few years ago I said to him, do you ever just, in the course of the day when you're painting, say, God, you're just a fucking failure? And he said, oh, at least 3 or 4 times a day. And it honestly made me feel so much better because, you know, as you're working on these things, you think, is this any good? You know, is anybody going to want to read this? At least I do. You know, it's a very common thing. And I think it's common probably to most people. You know, you wonder if what you're working at so hard, no matter what it is, what job, is it going to make the world better? Is it going to reach people in the way you want? It's just hard to know. But intuition is, for me as a writer, it's probably 75%. I am a chaotic writer. I just spew words onto the page. And when I'm beginning a new novel, oftentimes what I do is just give myself a word quota per day, you know, 2,000 words a day. And they'll be crappy words, but it doesn't matter as long as my fingers are moving, you know, and getting words onto the page. It's like panning for gold. You know, maybe there'll be a few nuggets of gold at the end of a month of panning through all this dirt and sand. That's what writing a novel feels like to me. I am also an extremely fast typist, and I only write novels on the keyboard. And so my goal is to type so fast that I outrace my thoughts, you know, that I get into this groove where the words and the people are taking over and I'm not consciously sending them in a certain direction. And that takes a lot of energy. It's like a physical energy. You have to kind of get the fire inside. And then 2,000 words doesn't take me long if I'm really moving. And yet at the end of it, I'm just done. I can't spew out any more words. I can do laundry and vacuum and go for a hike and, you know, things like that, but I can't churn out any more words for the day. So I think in partial answer to your question, I am dependent on intuition. And in order to get to the intuition, I have to kind of spin myself into this groove. And a lot of times what I do is I sort of view the people as creating themselves. And in order to do that, I will give myself a prompt. So for most of my books, I have ended up making a list of random objects off the top of my head. And the rule is that all those objects have to have a place in the book by the time the book is over. And that gives you, because if you're chaotic like me and you don't know what your book is about when you start it, where do you start? You know, you sit there and you look at the blank screen and you think, oh, I want to write a beautiful book, but about what, you know, and how? At least that's how I am. So for not this book, but other books, for example, my novel Shadow Baby, I made a list of objects in about a minute. And it included things like an onion and a bloody shoe and a dented tin object and the spiced ginger and a miniature dark green sink and things like that. And then if you're going to write 2,000 words, well, if you have a bloody shoe and you just kind of throw it into your mental room and then you put a foot in the shoe and you start walking and you write down what happens, well, you have a scene, you know, and something to start with. And I'm embarrassed to say that's actually how I start writing my books because it seems so random. But the people just grow, you know, they grow out of these objects and scenes. And I usually, in my adult novels, have the landscape to count on. And something I did not expect when I began writing novels is that the same characters would appear and reappear in different books and at different stages of their lives. When I began writing, I was a young woman and I thought I would write a trilogy of novels set in the Adirondacks and that would take me my whole life. And it didn't. So I had to keep going. And luckily I find that as I get older, my characters appear in different stages of their lives and I get to check in on them. They only appear of their own volition, though. I can't will them into being, which pisses me off. I would like to do that. But it doesn't happen that way.
Well, that's so cool. I love it. Well, Heather says she doesn't have a question, but she says that she loved it. She loved your reading. So that was from Heather.
Heather, you know, here's the thing about Heather. She's an incredible writer. I don't know if you've ever read her novels. They are thrillers for the most part, but holy crud, this woman is amazing. And she and I met a couple of years ago at a book festival in South Dakota. Heather, honestly, I just loved you at first sight. So I'm so happy to see you. And I keep up with Heather on Twitter because I just, you know, that's one good thing about the age we live in. We can just check in on people. Yeah, she just had a new book come out. Look it up. It's great.
Okay. Another question is, do you often look to news stories for inspiration? And how is your writing being affected by the pandemic?
Oh, I'm only laughing because I have been working on a new novel for a year and a half now. And I've had 2 very solid drafts of this new novel. And in the last month, I have decided to rewrite it entirely from scratch and set it post-pandemic. So yes, I'm entirely affected by the times we're living through right now. And I'm affected by, yeah, story, books that I read, poems in particular, music that I listen to, and art that I see are the main inspirations for my books. So I suppose it's a pan-artistic approach to creating my art form, which is novels, you know, novels and picture books, but all art just feeds me. And it's painful not to be able to go to live readings right now, go to live movies or movie theaters, you know, go gallery hopping. It's hard. Music is a constant, and poems are a constant for me. First thing when I wake up in the morning, I read 8 poems. I have them all bookmarked on my computer. So that begins my day every morning. And if I find one that I love, I will squirrel it away in my poetry files. And poems are probably the greatest inspiration from literature for me, but novels, memoirs, children's books, some children's picture books are so astonishingly, I don't even know the word for them. They're reverential in a way, and they encompass all ages and all of life in a picture book. It's an amazing thing when someone can do that. So yes, I'm very inspired. I don't understand writers. There are a number of writers who say they only read literature from the 1800s or early 1900s, and I don't understand that. I'm a writer of the age in which I am living, and I don't want to be anything else. I want to be influenced by changes in language and by the invention of new forms. I'd like to invent them myself. You know, I guess I love contemporary art, and I am a contemporary writer. And contemporary poems, they are what I love too.
Who's your favorite poet at the moment?
Oh, that's a very painful question. That's like, who is your favorite child? I have a lot of favorite poets. In fact, I just started a podcast that's about storytelling, and it ends with a poem. Each episode ends with a poem. Some of my favorite poets are Danusha Lamaris, Marie Howe, William Stafford, Ocean Vuong, Andrea Gibson, Ellen Bass, Sharon Olds, of course, Naomi Shihab Nye, Billy Collins, Ross Gay, Lucille Clifton. Oh, don't stop. I can't.
Well, I love it. Well, during the 6 years in which you took to write the book, did current events change your mind about what would happen?
I wanted them to change my mind, actually. That's a very good question. As our administration has become increasingly conservative, I personally have been scared and very nervous. I wanted the change in our country to affect the events in the book, but I can't say that they did. These people just did what they did, and the events unfolded as they unfolded. And one thing that I have found surprising in reactions to the book are that people believe I was incredibly even-handed in my treatment of these potentially explosive topics. And that makes me very happy. It proves that I did my job as a fiction writer, I think. Were I to write an essay or a nonfiction book about these topics, I think it would have a very different tone.
No, I agree with them because it definitely, it was very balanced and it was very, I agree totally with that. Oh my gosh. You would never know, and you never knew what was coming, and the sides were presented so beautifully.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, it was great.
Well, I credit my upbringing for some of that. I grew up, as I've told you, in a very rural, blue-collar, all-white, hard-working, hard scrabble, poor part of the country. And when I go home to visit my parents, who still live in the house I grew up, and where my father at age 85 just decided he needed to chop a tree down in the swamp yesterday because they didn't have enough wood for next winter. Dad, oh. But when I go to the diner with my dad, you know, I sit with him and these men that I have known and loved my whole life and whom I respect and adore. And I mean that genuinely. And if I could cancel out their vote in November, I certainly would. But it is always a lesson to me in how people are complicated, and they are not black and white and one-dimensional the way so much of our online presence would portray them. So it keeps me always aware of the complications of being a human being, you know, being a fiction writer. It's an ongoing lesson to me. So I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
I have to say one thing. Pat, who had raised a hand, didn't type a message. So they've asked if Pat could type the question that I'll shoot it out. But here's another question. I wonder if you feel differently about writing or about your subject matter in the context of COVID-19. So do you feel differently about it?
Yeah, I do. I have two separate reactions. One, and I know that many of my artist and writer friends are saying the same thing, like, what does it matter? You know, who cares what we're doing? It feels like everything is different. It's a strange and troubling time. And what really does matter? You know, does art matter? Do books matter? Should I be working on another book? Should I be making another painting? I hear this from so many people. Mm-hmm. And I completely understand that, because I feel as if none of us are going to know exactly how this time affected us until we have been through it for quite a while. And I don't know when that is going to be. But on the other hand, I also know, you know, this is the two sides of the two forces coming to bear on me. I know that art has saved my life since I was a child. if I had not found poetry and books when I was a very small girl, I don't know how I would make it through this life. It's so, art has always helped me make sense, not even make sense of the world, but process the world, process experience through the writing of a story or a poem. It has helped me transcend experience, even as I'm living it, and afterward helped me make sense of it. So I guess I feel that the reaction of what does this even matter is natural. It's something that we feel when the world has turned upside down. And I think for me, the answer is always going to come down to art is essential. You know, art is something that we all have to have. When you look at those cave paintings from thousands of years ago, people have been making art ever since they possibly could. I was in Lisbon in a museum in February, which seems like many years ago at this point. Like, how could I even get on a plane? How could I just walk around without a mask? It's amazing. But I saw this little shard of pottery from, oh, I think 3,000 years ago. And it had been so carefully painted and glazed. And it was just a shard of pottery from, you know, a storage container that must have held pickles or something. But people crave beauty and they crave art. And so to me, it's just, it's essential, you know? We can't do without it. We don't want to do without it. Everybody's always trying to make everything beautiful.
Oh, I agree. How do you think your writing has changed, if it has changed, since Shadow Baby?
Oh, you know, it's weird how fast time goes by. I wrote Shadow Baby 20 years ago. It was the second of my trilogy that was going to take me my whole life. I don't think my writing has changed much since Shadow Baby. I had to reread it to make sure all the details were correct for my novel Never Coming Back, which picks up on those, on Clara Winter and Tamar, her mother, are the stars of Shadow Baby, and they are also the stars of Never Coming Back, which takes place 20 years later. So I had to reread it, and I thought, oh, you really haven't changed much. It just felt like, oh, I could have written that book now. But I will say that my writing has, back then I only wrote novels for adults, and since then I've just pushed into brave new territory of picture books and novels for children and indefinable things like the Bink and Golly books, and less other indefinable things like my book, What I Leave Behind, which is 100 chapters of 100 words each. So I'm always, I'm restless, and I always want a new challenge. And in that way, I think that has intensified in the years since I wrote Shadow Baby, if that is an answer to your question.
So someone else wrote, I love reading books that have controversial subject matter. It makes me consider alternate viewpoints than my own. Have you had any pushback or encouragement from readers about the topic?
Very surprisingly, no. I expected a lot of pushback about this. I did not expect to hear people on both sides of the abortion issue, for one thing, or religion. You know, there's another theme of very, very, what's the word? Immersive religion. You know, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, which tells you, and I'm a devoted Unitarian Universalist, which tells you a lot about the kind of religion I gravitate to, I suppose. But these themes of religious controversy and pregnancy versus termination controversy, I expected there would be a great deal of pushback. And I had friends tell me, just be prepared, you know, be prepared. You're being very brave here. And that has not happened. And I think it goes back to maybe that I made it, that it came out as a balanced book, which makes me happy. You know, my only goal is to present real people, because when you see people not as enemies, not as black and white, but as real people with deep histories that you don't know, that all come to bear on why they believe what they do, what the religion they're drawn to, the way they vote in the voting booth, then life becomes both much more complicated and much gentler. I guess that's the word. And so maybe that is what has happened in the book. But I've been surprised at how there has not been much of that. Some of my books are banned, like children's books, like, you know, about Halloween because there's a witch in it. I don't know. And I've gotten pushback for books that I would never have thought of in my life, but not for this one so far.
Ken, well, are you bringing back the bird from Pablo and Birdie?
Oh, goodness. All right, my book, Pablo and Birdie. Just a little backstory. Pablo is a boy turning 10, about to turn 10, and he doesn't know what his real birthday is. He lives in a semi-magical place, the island known as Isla, and all he knows about his past is that he floated in, strapped into an inflatable swimming pool after a huge storm with a parrot, her talons gripped on the swimming pool, watching over him. That's all he knows. And the myth of this island is that there is a parrot that no one has ever seen that holds within it all the sounds and all the voices that have ever existed in the entire world. So everyone who has ever lived and died, this parrot, under certain conditions, can reproduce everything that was ever said. So when you think about it, you know, you could hear what Jesus said. You could hear Martin Luther King in, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther. You could hear Gandhi. You could hear, you know, Genghis Khan. You could listen to all these voices. And so Pablo, because he doesn't know anything about his past, would love to find one of these parrots and maybe learn what happened to him, why he was found floating on the ocean as a little baby, you know, who was his first family. And so the bird, Birdie in Pablo and Birdie, has never said a word. And at the end of the book, she's not in the book anymore. And will she come back? Will I bring the bird back? The answer is probably no, I have to say. I don't have any plans to return to Pablo and Birdie.
Oh!
I see someone just like...
Yeah, I saw it too.
But you never know, Diane, you never know.